I'm John Burnham Schwartz, Literary Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and this is Beyond the Page. In this episode, recorded live at the 2024 Writers Conference, novelist Kristin Hannah talks to Jenny Emery Davidson, the Executive Director of the Community Library in Ketchum, Idaho, about her #1 New York Times bestselling novel, The Women. Known for previous historical novels such as The Nightingale, The Great Alone, and The Four Winds, in The Women, Hannah takes up the Vietnam epic and recenters the story on the experience of the military nurses who worked under fire on bases and in field hospitals throughout the war, but whose sacrifice and commitment to their country has all too often been forgotten. Like so many male soldiers of the time, Frankie McGrath, the novel's heroine, finds herself overwhelmed by the chaos and destruction of war, as well as the unexpected trauma of coming home to a changed and politically divided America.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, Kristin Hannah.
Hi, guys. This is so great. Thank you.
So we're here in the opening session of the opening day of the literary extravaganza that is the Sun Valley Writers Conference. And this year's theme is origin stories. So I've been pondering the question of where do stories originate? You've written more than 24 novels, and they've covered a lot of geography. They've covered big time spans and various historical and dramatic situations. So I really want to know, what is the magic room like where all of this creation happens? Can you tell us something about your actual writing space? And does it change for the different novels? Like, I'm wondering if you've gone from Dorothea Lange photographs to photographs from Vietnam. What's your writing space like, and how does it inform your work?
So wait, are you asking about the actual location, the physical location where I write?
You write, yeah.
I write everywhere. I have 3 offices in my home. I use none of them. They just collect my to-be-read pile, which is so big. I write longhand on yellow legal pads. I read and write in beach chairs on the beach, when the kids are out skiing, on my back deck, wherever I want to. So it's all in my head. And as far as the space, your question also kind of leans a little bit into research. So what research do I do? And for the novels of the last 15 years, probably from Winter Garden on, the historical novels, I do about a year of research. And that's when I'm just reading, and taking notes and taking pictures. And yes, Dorothea Lange, I lived with her for like a year, and Vietnam, and all of these images and thoughts and information. And then I take all of that and I begin to form a narrative that I think best represents and recreates what it is I have to say. And what it is I have to say usually is that we women have been forgotten and overlooked, and it's about time that someone tells our stories. And so that's what I've been looking for, are women's lost stories. And this particular one, The Women, I've wanted to write for 25 years. I first pitched it to my editor in, 1996, I think. And my editor, who had been at Berkeley in 1968, said, "Oh, honey, you're not ready. And nobody wants to read about the Vietnam era either. So come back when you are." So it's been all these years of me waiting to write this story. And I have to say, it feels remarkably like I wasn't the only one waiting to read this story.
What made you ready now?
Well, like I said, this current incarnation of my career is about women's lost story and historical novels. So I always knew that this would be a historical novel, although I push back on the idea that my own life is a historical novel, but that's what they say. So I knew it would be historical, but I didn't know exactly what I had to say about the era. And then COVID hit. I live in a small town in Washington on an island, and we were seriously locked down. No restaurants, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do. And I was watching, of course, how divided our country was, and it felt like the Vietnam era again. So that was, I think, step one. And then again, watching the news, I was seeing our nurses and our doctors who were on the front lines of this pandemic, and the difficulties they were facing, and my sense that sometimes they weren't getting the support that they needed. And that's when it all just came together, and I went, I'm going to write about the nurses who served in Vietnam.
I love thinking about that decades-long gestation period and then the kind of catalyst of this shared crisis of the pandemic that propelled this novel forward.
Yeah, I think it was just kind of a lucky moment in time. And I've been able to connect, of course, in doing the research with some remarkable Vietnam nurse vets. And hearing their story and their children's stories has been, it's probably been the most vital and important moment of my career. I feel like I've been spending all these 25 years in a way so I could write this book. Now I just have to figure out what's next, which is horrible.
It's the texture of your details in The Women and in your previous novels that makes them so absorbing to read. And the quantity, the depth of the research that must inform that is really astonishing. And I'm wondering if, as you're doing your research, there are certain kinds of historical details that you're looking for, or that when you find them, you're like, that's what's going to make this real. Because it's not just getting the location right in Vietnam, it's the shoes that someone is wearing. So what details really resonate with you, and how and where do you find them?
I mean, that's really true. I think that's what takes a book from a historical novel to a novel that you feel that you are a part of, that you could live in. And that is, I think, a specific detail question. And I think for me personally, it goes back to my geek girl days, my fantasy era when I was young and loving, the Lord of the Rings and, all of those kinds of books, and loving world building. And I think, that level of specificity to create a world that did in fact exist, but we haven't quite experienced it the way I want you to. And there's always details in the reading. I'll never forget when I was writing The Four Winds a few years ago, which was about the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. And I was reading somebody's memoirs, and they were talking about the storms in the Dust Bowl. And when they hit, that all of the centipedes came crawling out of the walls. And I thought, oh man, I got to put that in. I mean, that's the most horrific thing I can imagine. And so I'm looking for things like that, little moments that transport you, that really make a world come alive.
I think of the Ski Vietnam t-shirt.
Yeah.
I think of the black overnight bag, belts, headbands, shoes, and the language. I'm wondering what it was like for you to immerse yourself in military language, which I hesitate to even quote because I'm not sure I'll say it correctly, like Mascal and FNGs, even the cursing. How did you learn that language?
Well, that's the job, honestly. I wrote a book several years ago called Homefront about a female Black Hawk pilot who deployed. And I called her up out of the blue and, said, I'm writing this novel and would you please speak to me and help me and stuff. She's like, sure, come on down. So I went down to Joint Base McChord. And I had done 6 months of research at this point. And I sat down and she started talking. And everything was the BBD and the da-da-da and the blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what are you saying to me? I understood nothing of what she said. And she said, oh, I understand. Okay, let's go back. and kind of gave me the basics. And I was always, then and with the women, very nervous about getting those kinds of details right because it's so important, and it's not my world. And in fact, in this book, one of the things that was interesting was when I wrote the first draft, the Vietnam section, the war section, took place in 2 hospitals. And I created fake names for those hospitals because I was afraid in writing it that the latrines would be in a different place or that the commissary would be in a different place or I would have the OR wrong or something. And when I gave the novel to my vets to read, their overwhelming comment was, you have to use the real names. And I said, but what if I've made a mistake? And they said, oh, they moved around all the time. And they said, and frankly, if you did, we'd rather have a mistake at the real place than a fake place. That's the first time I've ever run into that. So that was kind of interesting. Frightening, but interesting.
That's interesting to me, too, that they insisted on use the real names. Given what becomes a refrain throughout the novel, I was there. And there's also a point in the novel, this is early on, Frankie's in the field hospital tent and she's facing yet another soldier with catastrophic injuries. And she's working with a rookie surgeon. And the rookie surgeon freezes up. And she looks across this wounded soldier and says to the surgeon, see him, see Specialist Glenn Short.
That's the whole arc of this book for Frankie in particular, going back to unforgettable heroines. I mean, I think the reason that Frankie is so relatable and so interesting is she begins this novel so completely unprepared for this experience that she has chosen. And that particular moment shows the arc of Frankie over this time period, because she begins on day one thinking, I have no business being here. She had about 3 weeks of nursing training, and they send her off to Vietnam, and she's in a hospital with all these critical injuries, and she doesn't know how to start an IV, basically, to the point where a year later, a doctor comes in, and he's that overwhelmed again. And so now it's on her to say, let me help you. This is how you do it, one person at a time. I ended this novel so incredibly in awe of nurses in general, and the job that they do and the compassion they bring to it and the toll that they pay for these kinds of situations.
How did you arrive at the starting point and how to introduce Frankie?
I chose where I chose because I tried everything else, and they didn't work as well. I mean, I wrote a draft of the book where we started with Frankie at 13 and showed her whole life. And I just keep paring away until I get to exactly what it is I need. And I never know exactly what I need until I get there, which is a really disturbing proposition, frankly. So I just keep going back and learning her and layering her life. And the point is really that I want to create someone who is very like the women who went there and show the arc that is very like what so many of them dealt with. And, you got to remember, at this time period, we're talking about women who came of age in the late 50s, early 60s, which was a very different time. And a lot of the memoirs that I read, which are listed in the back of the book, and I can't recommend them highly enough, these women were just young, eager, patriotic, and volunteered to go to war. And, you see in the book, one of the interesting things is they have a party for her brother who goes off to war. They're all very excited. And then Frankie goes off and her parents are horrified. What are you doing? You've got no business being over there. And that sort of starts the whole arc of her journey of sort of coming into her own and finding her voice and being the woman that she chooses to be, not the woman that she was raised to be.
The novel, like Frankie's life, has two distinct sections. There's the Vietnam section, and then there's the after Vietnam, back in the U.S. section. And I'm wondering, did you write them in that order? How did one inform the other? When you were writing Vietnam, were you already imagining what comes after? Would you go back and reread Vietnam as you were going through what was happening in that after world? And was one section harder to write than the other because they're traumatic in very different ways?
Yeah, Ridley's over here laughing because he knows I've got the worst process in the world for all of this. I imagined a very different book originally. So I wrote that book, and that was really a love story. And that's why I said it started when she was young, and it was a love story, and it was a love story with a man that went to Vietnam with her. The problem was the Vietnam section of this novel, from scene one, day one, stayed almost exactly the same. I always knew what Vietnam was like and what it looked like and what I had to say. I had less clarity on what came after. And in fact, I did a lot of pushing back on what ended up becoming the second half of the story, which is the vets coming home to being poorly treated, and the women especially being invisible, and the struggles that a lot of them faced with their undiagnosed PTSD, and especially women who were told, even by the VA, how could you have any kind of emotional trauma? You weren't in combat, and all of those sorts of things. I really pushed back on that because I felt like I had written that before and that it was so dark. And I just loved Frankie by this time, and I just wanted to prop her up and say, you go, girl, this was great. But ultimately, it just didn't feel real. So that's when I ended up realizing that with as powerful as the Vietnam section of this novel was, the second half had to be as powerful or more. And when the first half and the power comes from combat, it's really hard to keep that level for another, 300 pages. I hope I answered that. I'm not sure.
I love that.
Rambling.
I mean, to think of the power came from combat and the viscerality of that in the first section, and it's a lot of interior tumult that is also violent in the aftermath.
You put life or death on the table, the book writes itself. That's why World War II books are so powerful. It's why war novels are so powerful. You're like, oh, I may die today. Okay. But then you have the whole rest of your life. And that has to feel to the reader as important. And the stakes have to be just as high to heal her, I guess.
We're going into war. We know there's going to be drama there. But I think one of the most taught relationships in the novel is between Frankie and her father. So speaking to that generation gap, I mean, there are love stories in this novel, but I think the man arguably who wreaks the most havoc on her heart is her father. Could you speak to that?
It was really important to me because, in reading these memoirs about the nurses who went, almost all of them came from the greatest generation families who had grown up on patriotic stories of their family's service in World War II. And that was very deeply ingrained. And so that created this juxtaposition because here his daughter is going off to war. And I very clearly made her father not a war veteran because I wanted him to really think that he knew what war was, but he didn't. And it's Frankie who knows what war is when she comes home and essentially has to teach her father what he's been wrong about in a lot of ways. For me, one of the most powerful moments in the book is when her father understands the mistake. That was one of the most important moments to me that the whole book was working towards, was trying to get her family healed again. She comes to a moment in this book at some point, I can't remember where it is, but in the second half, where she accepts that her parents may never understand, may never be proud of her, may never ask her questions about Vietnam, may prefer to pretend that those couple of years never happened. And she's okay with that because she understands that families have rough edges and that people have dark corners. And sometimes we just have to accept people for who they are and sort of move on and heal ourselves.
And her whole notion of healing and what that can look like, I think, really evolves over the course of the novel. And of course, Barb and Ethel are her family throughout much of this, and it's a different kind of family. I see friendship between women as really a driving consideration throughout your work. And I wonder if you were surprised in any way how those female friendships took shape in this particular novel.
Yeah, it's interesting. So really, for all of the many things this book is about, female friendship is the beating heart of it. That is what this book is about. It's interesting because I didn't see that for a very long time. I thought it was about other things. I thought it was a love story. I thought it was a war story. I thought it was a woman's journey. And really, in the writing process, I was writing Frankie, and this whole book is in her viewpoint, which means I'm very narrowed as an author. I can only know what she knows. I can only write about what she sees and experiences. And I tend to create characters as I need them. I remember I'm riding along and she's on the plane that you've talked about. She's been dropped in Vietnam. She is completely unprepared. She has no business being here. They move her from place to place, and they finally put her in what's called a hooch, which is her little cabin quarters at the hospital, and drop her off. And I'm describing the hooch per research as 3 little corners, with a woman in each one. And I go, I'll need 2 women. Okay. I wonder who these 2 women are. And
who are they?
So, I'd sort of put them in based on research. And in the evolution of this novel, as it went from the love story to what it was, these 2 women just kept coming forward and kept forming and became essentially soulmates. And it's kind of like my novel Firefly Lane, where I show you that female friendship can be as deep, as powerful, as important as a soulmate. And I think that's what these 3 women are. And I loved writing the scenes, where they showed up for each other, because I think that's what girlfriends do.
They're irrepressible, and it changes the dynamic both before and after Vietnam. Do you have a talisman?
Does wine count? Because that's... No. I don't know. I mean, I'm not much of a collector or, that kind of stuff. No. But books. I have books everywhere. I wrote once that books were the mile markers of one of my characters' lives. And that's what it is for me. I look back on every era by what I was reading. And when my son started coming of age, I couldn't wait to pass along the books that meant something to me. Is he ready for Lord of the Rings yet? Is he ready for Dune? And now my granddaughter, I'm gauging her and passing along the books that I love to her. So I guess books.
Books are the best talismans.
I guess so.
I want to ask you about the title. The title is simple. It is unadorned. It does not specify a time or place. It is plural. How did you come to the title?
So there are 2 things I am particularly bad at in this job that I have. One of them is picking what I'm going to write. I have a very hard time wrangling an idea. I can't pick a refrigerator, so you can imagine what it takes me to decide to spend 3 years on. And the other one is titling. I'm terrible. For this book, I can't remember what it was originally called, but I know that I loved the title and nobody else did. And the fact that I can't now remember it is perhaps a sign that that they were right. So we went back and forth, my editor and my agent and I, trying to title this. We'd text each other or email each other. And finally, I sort of threw up my hands and I said, how about The Women? And everyone said, well, that's a terrible title. What women? Where? And I thought, well, that's true, right? So it seems too generic. So we kept trying. And every couple of weeks, I'd say, how about The Women? And my editor would say, no, that's no good. Then I got a text from her one day, and she said, I was just out, I had a thought. What if we did? And she came up with the sort of tagline on the back, the missing, the forgotten, the brave, the women. And I went, those are my women. And then we put a helicopter on the cover. And that was it. And then I sent it to my fabulous Vietnam nurse, Diane Carlson Evans, who I consulted with and who helped me in this. She wrote a great book called Healing Wounds, which I highly recommend. I said, okay, I think we're going to call it The Women. And she said, well, that's a terrible title. What women? So then she writes me this long note, and at the end it says, Diane Carlson, one of the women. And I wrote back and I said, Diane, you just identified as one of the women. She goes, oh, yeah. Okay, it's a good title. So there you go.
You said at one point there was a concern, it seems too generic, but to me that speaks to the thrust of the whole novel, that these women are aching really to go from being anonymous, generic to identified.
I certainly believe that. And interestingly enough, which I never expected, I do occasionally hear pushback from people that their argument with it is that this is about one woman. So why did I call it The Women? And I maintain that it's about all the women. It just is one woman's story, but it's about all of them. So
I think it's about Frankie's mother, too.
it is.
You know, the letters that go back and forth and her evolution. Frankie becomes a vehicle for multiple women's stories.
I think so, yeah.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm wondering if we could circle back, Kristin, to you talking about going to the inauguration of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And I think that's such a significant component of the women. We really have 3 different memorials, I think, throughout it. We have the Heroes Wall, which we are introduced to in the opening pages. Frankie's father has all of these photographs of men in the family who have served, no women. And then we know that the Vietnam War Memorial is going to come, but the actual last word of the novel is not a word, it's a photograph. And it's just a photograph of that. Could you talk about those different memorials and what it means to memorialize? Each of those, I think, defines heroes in a very different way.
Who was I speaking to? I think it was somebody on NPR was talking about the last couple of pages of the novel. And the interviewer says, it feels like you're just speaking to us. Like, you're telling us what you think and what it is you have to say in these last couple of pages. And I'm like, that's pretty much what it was. And that's what I was thinking. And it's because by the time I got there, and actually those final pages and the end of the book changed in the weeks after I went to the memorial, because I sort of realized the power of all of this, of meeting these veterans, which, I hadn't met any of them before. I think it really became about me understanding that remembrance and gratitude matters. I've written before about vets and PTSD, and I speak passionately about the importance of taking care of people who have risked so much for us and sacrificed so much for us. So I just wanted the novel to be, at the very end, the last moment was, don't forget to remember, because it means so much.
Kristin Hannah, thank you for writing books that help us to remember and help us to see.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Page. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. A good one, we hope. To catch all the latest from the Sun Valley Writers Conference, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to this conversation in its entirety, or to any of our other talks, you can find them at svwc.com. I'm John Burnham Schwartz. Until next time.